Imagine this, being trapped, completely helpless, and at the mercy of someone you once trusted. Your pleas echo through empty hallways as you realize no one is coming to save you. This is the story of Jamie Forbes, a man whose visit to a friend turned into an unimaginable nightmare. But what really happened behind those locked doors? Before we get into the details of this intense and chilling story, please like this video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss more stories that reveal the darkest side of human nature. Let's dive in. Jamie Forbes was a 37-year-old man known for his kind nature and easygoing personality. So, when he visited a friend in Aberdeen on a typical January day, he had no reason to expect anything out of the ordinary. But the moment he walked through the doors of that 12th floor flat, something felt wrong. His friend, Lee Smith, seemed distant, his behavior more tense than usual, and the apartment was unusually quiet. What Jamie didn't realize was that this was no ordinary visit. Within minutes of arriving, he found himself locked inside with no way to escape. Unbeknownst to him, Lee had reversed the lock on the door. Jamie was now a prisoner in the one place he thought he was safe, a friend's home. Initially, Jamie tried to shrug off Lee's strange behavior, but the situation escalated quickly. Lee, who was known to struggle with obsessive-compulsive disorder, began accusing Jamie of theft. According to Lee, Jamie had stolen piece 40, a claim Jamie couldn't understand or refute. It was only piece 40, but to Lee, this supposed theft became a reason to unleash something far more sinister. Lee's anger erupted, transforming him from a friend into a relentless tormentor. With no escape and no way to reason with him, Jamie's nightmare truly began. Every time he tried to speak, Lee cut him off with furious accusations. As the hours dragged on, Jamie realized he was facing something far worse than an argument. Jamie's ordeal intensified as Lee turned to violence. What started as verbal abuse quickly escalated to physical assault. The first blow landed like a shockwave. Lee struck Jamie with a hammer, catching him off guard. Jamie reeled from the pain, his mind struggling to comprehend the horror of his situation. Before he could recover, another blow followed. Punches, kicks, and hammer strikes rained down on him without pause. Lee's anger was relentless, and with every strike, Jamie's hope for escape dimmed. Jamie fought to stay conscious, his body battered and broken, trapped within the confines of the flat. The minutes stretched into hours, each one filled with terror. Lee showed no mercy, each assault more brutal than the last. In his mind, Jamie's theft justified the punishment, but for Jamie, it was a punishment without end. As dawn broke on January 15th, a glimmer of hope appeared. Somewhere in the building, a construction worker heard cries echoing from above. It was Jamie, summoning every bit of strength he had left to call for help. He shouted for the police, his voice growing hoarse with desperation. The worker paused, glancing up, uncertain of the source of the voice, but knowing that something was wrong. Around the same time, another resident heard the desperate cries for help. She called emergency services, describing the voice that seemed to drift down from the upper floors. Police arrived, but locating Jamie proved more challenging than expected. Officers knocked on doors from the 6th to the 8th floors, but without a clear indication of where the voice had come from, they found nothing. They reassured residents and construction workers that they'd return if the shouting continued, then left, unaware of the horror occurring just a few floors above. For Jamie, this was a devastating blow. Help had been so close, just outside his reach, yet it slipped away. In that moment, the crushing realization set in he was on his own. His voice, once filled with hope, faded into silence. Hours later, two individuals, Simon Strilsick and Cindy Alexander, entered Lee's flat. Perhaps they'd stopped by unannounced, or maybe Lee had invited them. Regardless, what they walked into was beyond comprehension. Bloodstains marred the walls and floors, and Jamie lay on the ground, his body bruised, beaten, and barely recognizable. Lee, surprisingly calm, revealed to them that he had locked Jamie in the apartment, intending to keep him there for 3 days. In his mind, this was justice for the supposed P40 theft. He confessed openly, as though his actions were somehow justified. Jamie was little more than an object of his anger now, lying helpless and battered on the floor. Shyman and Cindy stood frozen, horrified by the sight of Jamie's broken body. They watched in shock as Lee dragged him to the bathroom, treating him with disturbing detachment. As he placed Jamie in the bathtub, the two witnesses left, unable to process the scene they had just witnessed. Inside that flat, Jamie's world had shrunk to a dark, agonizing cycle of pain and fear. He was trapped, cut off from any chance of escape, and the beatings had left him weakened. The moments passed slowly, each one a test of his endurance. Bruised, bloodied, and facing the possibility of death, Jamie knew that staying meant more suffering, or worse. With every ounce of his remaining strength, Jamie tried to think of a way out. The window became his last, desperate option. It was a terrifying thought, but the alternative to remain under Lee's control, with no end in sight, was a fate he couldn't accept. With his strength fading and hope nearly gone, Jamie made one final choice, an act of defiance against his captor. His body battered but his spirit unbroken, he prepared for one last, desperate attempt at freedom. For Jamie, the window on the 12th floor was both a terrifying prospect and his last hope. And with every beat of his heart, he felt the walls closing in. He had endured 2 days of unimaginable agony, and each second spent under Lee's control was another second of fear and pain. His battered body felt heavy, his mind clouded, but in this moment of pure desperation, Jamie knew that he couldn't wait any longer. He edged toward the window, his heart pounding as he looked down at the distant ground below. To any passerby, it would have been a horrifying sight. A man, bloodied and weak, standing at the edge of a high-rise window, clinging to his last shred of hope. For Jamie, though, it was freedom. He took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage left in his broken body. He knew the fall would be dangerous, perhaps fatal, but remaining in Lee's grasp felt like a fate worse than death. With a final, determined look out toward the open world, Jamie took his last step. The scene that followed was chaotic and heartbreaking. Passers-by, neighbors, and residents of the building gathered below, drawn by the horrific impact and the unmistakable realization of what had just occurred. Paramedics arrived swiftly, but it was too late. Jamie's injuries were beyond what any medical team could repair. His body, bruised and broken, was a tragic testament to the horror he had endured. As word spread of Jamie's fall, so too did questions about what led him to that desperate act. Police arrived at the scene, prepared for a standard investigation, but what they discovered inside Lee's flat was anything but ordinary. Upon entering the apartment, officers found bloodstains marking nearly every surface, painting a chilling picture of the violence that had taken place. In the center of it all stood Lee, eerily calm, washing dishes as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Lee's chilling detachment struck the officers as strange, but it wasn't until they began piecing together Jamie's ordeal that the true horror of his actions became clear. Police soon learned of Jamie's final pleas for help, his cries that had echoed the building just hours earlier. They spoke to residents and workers who had heard the shouts but couldn't pinpoint the source, leading to their earlier, unsuccessful search. One neighbor recalled hearing Jamie's voice calling out, "Please help me," over and over again, only to find silence when he searched for its source. Witnesses recounted hearing Jamie's screams from as early as 8 a.m. that morning, and yet no one had been able to help him. The reality of his desperate situation weighed heavily on everyone involved in the investigation, adding a layer of tragedy to an already horrific story. Then there were the accounts of Seaman and Cindy, the two visitors who had seen Jamie inside the flat that day. Their testimonies revealed details that painted a disturbing picture of Lee's mindset and intentions. They described Lee's detached demeanor, his twisted justifications, and his confession of locking Jamie in the flat as punishment. To Lee, this wasn't a crime, it was his version of justice. As the pieces of the story came together, it became clear just how much Jamie had suffered in those final hours. The combination of his physical injuries and the psychological torment he endured was enough to push anyone to the edge. Lee was promptly arrested and charged with culpable homicide, his detached demeanor never wavering. As the case moved to trial, the full extent of his actions came to light. The courtroom was filled with people who had known Jamie, family members who were devastated by the tragedy, and even members of the community who had been shaken by the events. As Lee's defense attempted to rationalize his behavior, a chilling portrait of a man consumed by anger and control emerged. The prosecution, led by lawyer Leanne McQuillan, laid out the grim details: the reversed lock on the door that prevented Jamie from leaving, the extensive blood stains found throughout the flat, and the brutal injuries Jamie had sustained over those 2 days. McQuillan highlighted how the abuse was so severe that Jamie felt his only escape was through the window. But it was the post-mortem report that truly silenced the courtroom. Jamie's body bore extensive injuries, from bruises and abrasions to deep lacerations consistent with defensive wounds. These weren't just injuries from the fall, they were marks of the brutal assault he had endured in his final hours. Blunt force trauma to his head, face, and body told the story of a man who had fought desperately to survive, even when all hope seemed lost. As details of Jamie's ordeal became public, shockwaves rippled through Aberdeen. This wasn't just another tragic story, it was a chilling reminder of how cruelty and violence could hide in plain sight. People who had known Lee were shocked, unable to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the man described in the courtroom. The community gathered to remember Jamie, holding vigils in his honor, and local support groups began advocating for mental health awareness and early intervention for those struggling with anger and control issues. Neighbors who had heard Jamie's cries for help wrestled with feelings of guilt, haunted by the idea that they might have been able to prevent his tragic end. Local residents began organizing neighborhood watch programs, vowing to look out for one another more closely and to act at the first sign of trouble. For Jamie's family, the pain of losing him in such a brutal way was overwhelming. His parents, siblings, and friends remembered him as a kind and gentle soul who never deserved such an end. In the wake of his death, they channeled their grief into action, creating the Jamie Forbes Foundation to raise awareness of domestic abuse, entrapment, and psychological manipulation. The foundation partnered with local organizations to offer support to those in abusive situations and to educate the public about the dangers of toxic relationships and controlling behavior. For Jamie's family, this was their way of keeping his memory alive and ensuring that no one else would suffer as he had. Lee's sentencing brought a sense of closure but not full relief. As he stood before the judge in the High Court in Edinburgh, Lee seemed as detached as ever. Judge Lady Hood described his actions as cruel beyond words, noting that his obsession with control had led to unimaginable suffering. Despite his pleas, the judge made it clear that Lee's actions went beyond mere anger or mental health struggles, they were acts of calculated cruelty. Sentencing was set for November 29, 2024, and though many hoped for justice, no sentence could ever undo the suffering Jamie had endured or the loss his family felt. Jamie's story is a haunting reminder of how darkness can hide behind even the most familiar faces. It's a tale of betrayal, desperation, and the courage to fight back, even in the face of unimaginable odds. But if this story moved you, please share your thoughts in the comments. Remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that uncover the hidden struggles and triumphs of the human spirit. Thank you for joining us in honoring Jamie's legacy.